Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
Hello, I'm Lorene Mills, and welcome to Report from Santa Fe. Our guest today is really a legend in broadcasting in New Mexico, Art Schreiber. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Lorraine, and good seeing you.
Well, you are a broadcaster, a journalist, a public servant. You've been a champion for the blind. We'll get to that in a minute. But this very year, last month, you won the Arizona New Mexico Book Award for the best inspirational book in New Mexico. And here it is. It's called Out of Sight, Blind and Doing All Right. And here's actually the award, this wonderful award. Talk to me. How did it feel?
Well, it feels wonderful, and I'm very happy for Hal Simmons, a good friend of mine, a lawyer who represents the broadcasters as well as the Press Association. He and I talked for years about doing a book, and finally we did it, met every Monday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon for over a year, and this is the result. And I hope it helps people who are losing sight or are going blind.
Well, it helped me tremendously, Art. We'll come back to your career, but let's just talk about this book now because it's changed so many lives. I admit I have always been afraid of losing my sight, and I take vitamins, special eye vitamins and everything. But the subtitle, Blind and Doing All Right, you went from being the general manager of KOB with a long broadcast career we'll talk about in a minute, to suddenly waking up on vacation and thinking the lights were out, but it was your lights. Tell us about that experience.
Yes, I was on vacation, and I woke up and I could not see. I really thought my life was over, but the best thing that ever happened to me was I had a great friend, Jerry Landay, who worked for ABC, CBS. He was working for then the old Charles Kuralt Sunday morning show. Mm-hmm. And he had just done a feature on a reading machine, and he called, and the nurse happened to be there, and I gave her the phone to take the number down, and he said, "You got to call this man. This is a machine you got to get." And I had just been blind for a few months, and I called David Tiki in Boston, who manufactured the Kurzweil reading machine. And I didn't know it was $35,000 and the size of a small washing machine.
Oh.
And he said, "Wait a minute." I kept saying, "I want this machine." And he said, "Wait a minute, how long you been blind?" I said, 3 months. He said, "My friend, you better learn to function as a blind man before you get a reading machine." Best advice I've ever been given. I came back to Albuquerque. I went going through 14 eye surgeries, but the great thing was that KOB, owned by Hubbard Broadcasting at that time, the radio stations, the Stan Hubbard and his wife Karen never gave up on me. They believed in me, and I got training, and which you got to do, and I survived and have done very well since.
Well, you certainly have. So one of the things that I learned from this book is there are, is it the Alamogordo School for the Blind and Visually Handicapped?
There is a School for the Blind, which is a wonderful school now, run by Superintendent Linda Lyle, but also the Commission for the Blind, of which Tony Anaya appointed me the first chair when the commission became a law in 1986. Tony Anaya appointed me the first chairman, and Bill Richardson appointed me again after I was out for a few years with Gary Johnson's administration. Bill Richardson appointed me, and I'm still the chair. And the commission is wonderful. We have an orientation center in Alamogordo near the School for the Blind where we train adults who are either have lost their sight or are going blind. And that's where I went for 6 months. And it is just wonderful. The commission, the federal government, ranks the Commission for the Blind in New Mexico one of the top 3 in the United States.
Wonderful.
We're pretty proud of that.
Yes. In the book, Out of Sight, you talk about how you do train, how you move from being sighted to being blind. And I was fascinated, even something like pouring hot coffee. This is precarious, even if you've got 2 hands and can see.
Yes. But if you learn to put your index finger, of course I'm left-handed, so I pour with my left hand, but you put your index finger on the inside of the glass. Don't try it with hot water first, but pour, and then you'll learn, feel the heat against the finger, and you'll know that you've got enough in the glass or the cup.
Yes, and you even talked about sometimes you put a ping pong ball in there.
Yes, that's how I first started, with a ping pong ball, and then you put your hand over the glass like this, and when you feel the ball touching the palm of your hand, you know you've got enough.
Well, you described some, sometimes there'll be construction, and you've been walking on a sidewalk for months, and suddenly there's a 6-foot hole there, which you have encountered.
Yes.
Yeah.
I ended up in a ditch that the tree lawn had been dug out, and I had just come from the cleaners. But I point out in the book, Lorraine, that my trainer, a wonderful man by the name of Jose Sanchez, who is retired now from the Commission for the Blind, but he told me, he said, now, Art, I had just had one lesson of learning to go from my apartment, my condo, to the studios and back. And he said, just practice that. Don't do anything else. Just practice that. Well, Saturday came, and I thought, well, I got to get to the cleaners, and I remember where the cleaners is, around the corner. Well, I didn't know that they had dug out the tree lawn, and I get my cleaning. I walk across, step up. You should take your cane and make sure what you're stepping on, but I didn't. I just stepped up. Down into the ditch I go with my cleaning. And I finally dug my way up out of there, and I go back to the cleaners with my dirty cleaning.
Yeah.
And they said, Mr. Schreiber, what's going on? I said, I've been in that hole over there for a half hour, and you better redo my cleaning.
Yeah. Well, you point out that having a sense of humor is really, really important when you make this kind of life adjustment. And you still clearly have your sense of humor.
Well, I hope so.
Yes.
I hope I never lose that.
Well, I would like to take a moment and look back at your background, because you as radio grew, as broadcasting grew, you were there.
Yes.
And so talk about how growing up and listening to the radio as a kid, and then kind of give us a synopsis of your career, because you were with some amazing people.
Well, my father, who managed a farm, a big farm in Ohio, 2,000 acres. That's not a big farm in New Mexico, but that's a big farm in Ohio. And he managed it and was a preacher at a country church. And all we got was what was in the collection plate on a Sunday morning. And the most we ever got between 1932 and 1939 was $3.57. But parishioners would bring food and leave it in the vestibule of the church, a live chicken in a gunny sack. And that's how we survived. But my father then was asked to manage this large farm. And every day he would first listen to the 8 o'clock news in the morning, and I sat with him. I guess I was 6, 7, 8 years old, and I listened. I didn't know what I was hearing in the sense of what the news was doing, but I wanted to do that. And I lived with that the rest of my days, and when I fortunately got to college, majored in speech, got thrown out of the speech department, told by my major advisor to get out of the department get into something I could make a living at? Well, I majored in Bible philosophy and psychology, but when I graduated from college, I said, I'm going to get a job in radio, and I did.
Yes.
And then I got in the news business. I wanted to do news, and I was lucky that I got a big break. I got in Cleveland, a big station in Cleveland, and from there I went to a large company, Westinghouse Broadcasting Company, owned stations across the country. And then they assigned me to civil rights, politics, and manned space. And so that's how I covered Jack Kennedy before he ever was president. When he was fighting it out with Hubert Humphrey, the senator from Minnesota. He was fighting it out with Hubert Humphrey for the nomination. And I traveled with Jack and Jackie through Wisconsin, and then West Virginia, and that's when Hubert Humphrey threw in the towel. And Kennedy then went on to become president. Unfortunately, I had to cover his funeral. And then I was assigned civil rights. I remember I was covering Gordon Cooper's first flight was a 17-orbit flight, or 24 hours. So we had been up for days covering that story in Cape Canaveral. And then over the loudspeaker in our trailer came the bureau chief's voice, and he said, "You've all done a great job. I want you to lay in the sand for 2 days." And we all applauded. And he said, "But I want Art Schreiber to by landline." And I called him, and he said, Steinbach's wife is sick. He's covering Birmingham. It's burning up. Get over there as fast as you can. And that was my meeting with Bull Connor, the famous police chief of Birmingham, Alabama. He later became the head of the Highway Patrol, and later the head of the Alabama Democrat delegation at the convention in Atlantic City in 1964. I knew all those people, and then I met Martin Luther King, traveled with him through the South. I was with him when he spoke to 25 people in a small country church in Alabama, and I was with him at the Washington Lincoln Memorial,
my goodness.
Where he spoke to 250,000. And then I got to travel with or go cover the astronauts. John Glenn became a good friend because he was from Ohio, and I was from Ohio. I traveled with Goldwater in '64, with Lyndon Johnson. It was just a wonderful career. Became bureau chief for Westinghouse Broadcasting Company, and I headed the Washington and Foreign News Services for the company. So established bureaus all over Europe, Saigon, Hong Kong, and other places that I can't remember at the moment.
But for you to be a newsman during the time and have the beat of civil rights, politics, and manned space, that was one of the most exciting times in American history.
Yes.
And you were an eyewitness to all that. And it wasn't always serious, two of those men, Martin Luther King and Kennedy were assassinated. It wasn't always serious tragedies like that.
And I was assigned to cover the Beatles in 1964, and John Lennon, who I became good friends with. John Lennon always wanted to talk not about music, but he wanted to talk about Martin Luther King. He had met Kennedy, and he couldn't understand why he had been killed. And, of course, later Martin Luther King was assassinated, and John Lennon himself was a victim of an assassination.
Well, we're speaking today with Art Schreiber, a pioneering journalist and an author of a new book called Out of Sight. I'd like to hear a little more about the Beatles tour, because you were one of two Americans that did 3 weeks of their first North American tour in 1964.
Yeah.
And you would play Monopoly with John Lennon and George Harrison.
Yeah.
And you have a very cute clip. We're going to run this. This is Paul McCartney on the phone to you. You say this clip saved your job. Give us a little short version. And when we play the clip, we'll look at a couple of pieces from your beautiful scrapbook about your life with the Beatles, some pictures of them, press passes, and things like that.
Well, the bureau chief, who I reported to, was not happy that I was covering the Beatles and he insisted on I cover the Democratic Convention in Atlantic City at the same time. It was at the same time the Beatles tour started. Well, the compromise was that I covered the Democratic Convention, joined the Beatles in New York at the old Forest Hills Tennis Complex, where they performed for two performances. And so I joined them, and that's where I met them. And John Lennon said to me the second night on the tour that I was on the tour, he said, do you play Monopoly? I said, well, I play with my kids. He said, I got a board. And he said, George and I play. These other guys won't play. And so I played with Monopoly with John and George. But we had made a pledge never to ask for autographs, because we were constantly asked by very important people in our hometowns and in our places of work to get an autograph. And so my bureau chief called me and said, I want autographs. I said, Jim, I can't do it. And he hung up on me. We were on our way to New York. The Beatles were to perform that night at the Paramount Theater. By the way, I have a ticket to that theater.
In your scrapbook.
And it's $2.50. And anyway, that was going to be their final performance. The next day they were back to England. And Jim hung up on me when I couldn't get him autographs. I knew my career was in jeopardy. We were on the plane, and you can hear what I asked Paul McCartney.
Well, let's just give a minute. We'll listen to this clip of you and Paul McCartney. And meanwhile, we'll also show some of the pictures from your scrapbook. Let's give it a minute and listen.
We're on the plane almost to New York, and Paul McCartney is beside me, and this interview is for Margaret Ann Snyder, Paul. She saw you in Baltimore. She waved to you, and she thinks that she saw you wave to her.
Of course I did. I remember her now very well. Margaret Ann Snyder, there she was, looking a picture, looking like a vision. And she waved, and I thought, that's Margaret Ann Snyder, I thought, shouting. So I thought, well, I better wave back, hadn't I? And with a gay wave of my hand, I waved back. Of course, I'd recognize her anywhere. She's the girl with the long fair hair, and her father's got a little black penknife. I know her anywhere. Yes.
Paul, I know that she'd like to see you in New York, but you're going to have to leave tomorrow, so I'll bet she'll even be waving from Baltimore when you're leaving from New York.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll wave from New York.
All right.
And if she waves from Baltimore, we might see each other on telly.
Fine. And if I see her, I'll be sure and then send your personal message to her, right?
Okay, give her my love then, Art. Lots of love, Margaret Ann Schneider. Goodbye, and I'll see you.
Well, what a wonderful sense of humor he has. That's absolutely delightful. He just played right along with it. That must have been the happiest little girl in America.
Well, when I got back home, I had that put on a cartridge, and I sent to my bureau chief, Jim Snyder. And a week later, he called me and he said, we had a babysitter last night. I took the babysitter home. And when I came back, I went by Margaret Ann's room. I thought I heard something, and I pushed the door open. She was laying there with the tape recorder by her ear, and she looked up at me, and she said, he said my name. He said my name. And that saved my career.
Oh, good. Well, we're going to move on to other parts of your career, although it just is so striking how different things were then. Now everyone's taking selfies, everybody's giving autographs everywhere, but there was a distance between the entertainer, the star, and there were stars, nobody of that magnitude in a long time.
That's right. And just think, today I have no photographs with me and the Beatles. Well, if today everybody had a cell phone, everybody be taking pictures. It's the same going back to the Kennedys.
Yeah.
When I was with Jackie Kennedy one night, we were waiting for her husband to come out of the television studio, and I looked down, and Lorraine, I know you're not old enough, but women who are old enough remember nylon hose, and they got a runner in them, and then sometimes they got filled with air, and your leg looked like a balloon. And I looked down, and Jackie Kennedy had a long runner in her hose, and it was ballooning out. And she saw me look. She said, "Art, quit looking." And I said, "If I only had a camera."
Oh.
Today, there'd be a million on Facebook, Twitter, and every place else.
Well, let's come back to you went from a reporter to being a station manager, and you ended up at KOB Albuquerque after many other stops.
Yes.
I just have to say this, truth in disclosure here, that you were inducted into the Broadcasters Hall of Fame here in 2010. I know you through my late husband, Ernie Mills. He was in the Broadcasters Hall of Fame in 2003, and you each were named Broadcaster of the Year in different years, you in 1991, he in 1995. But you've seen so many changes in radio.
Oh, yeah.
What do you think what do you intuit might be coming in the future? We've got satellite radio now. We've got...
Yeah, I worry that people are getting trained in journalism, really trained. Now everybody can have a blog, and that doesn't mean that everybody is a good journalist.
Yeah.
And that concerns me a great deal. I love the fact that people like that are really good news people. Jim Belshaw, for example.
Yeah.
Although Jim, I don't think has a blog. I want him to, but those are the kind of people that ought to be writing. And I know there are some today that are, but radio. When we lost the fairness doctrine, and for television too, that hurt broadcasting, in my opinion. We need the fairness doctrine because we need, as the Communications Act used to say, all sides of important issues of public importance. And that's what was, but who knows, with Twitter, with the way communication is today, I'm not bright enough to see what it's going to be, but I know it's certainly not like the good old days that I and Ernie and you, we spent where you really wanted to check out a story before you ever put it on the air or in print. But today, we put it on the air, unfortunately, without checking it out very well.
Now, in with the advent of your blindness, you were able to really, through the support of KOB, you were able to use your radio and broadcasting expertise to so vastly improve the quality of life for blind people. The Newsline for the Blind.
Yeah.
That's such a gift. Tell us what it is.
Well, by telephone, I have access to over 350 newspapers around the world in this country, most of them obviously in this country, plus over 40 magazines, all accessible by touch-tone telephone, free of charge, through the Commission for the Blind and the National Federation of the Blind. That is just an incredible opportunity for blind people. Blind people used to have to wait until somebody read something to them. And now you can just pick up a touch-tone telephone, and if you're signed up with the Commission for the Blind, and you can have instant news. And you don't have to wait for someone else to read it. It is read to you by computer voice. In Albuquerque, we still have local newsline with the Albuquerque Journal and other newspapers around the state read by volunteers. So we have both in Albuquerque and New Mexico. But that is a fabulous opportunity. Blind people today are reading newspapers for the first time in their lives. That's incredible. And that is all as a result of the National Federation of the Blind, which started it.
And I would like to acknowledge that last year you got the Jacobus 10 book.
Yes.
It's a Dutch name, I think.
Jacobus ten Broek was the first president of the National Federation of the Blind.
And they give out a very prestigious award, and you got it last year for your humanitarian efforts to improve the quality of life for blind people.
Yes. It touched me very deeply. I'm very grateful. I've devoted the rest of my life to helping people who are losing sight or who are blind.
Well, you have received so many humanitarian awards because we only have a minute and a half left. I'm not going to go over them all. But the best book, the best inspirational book for Out of Sight, I'm going to hold it up here again. This is your book that you just won the award for, Out of Sight, Blind and Doing All Right. This is such a gift. Give me a 1-minute summary, what you want people who are blind or who are concerned about blindness, what they need to know based on your courage and your experience to just living a full life, even though you were stricken with this disability.
They need to understand that life isn't over. There is life after blindness. And they do need to know that they need training. I liken it, if someone is an alcoholic or a drug abuser, you and I can tell them, or their loved ones can tell them, oh, you need help, go get some help, but they have to do it. And we who are losing sight or blind, we have to come to grips with it ourselves. We have to say, I need help. And the Commission for the Blind is there to help. The National Federation of the Blind is there to help. And there are available access to individuals, but they need to come to grips with it and just accept the fact that we can't see, but we can still live a full life.
Well, we have to come to grips with the fact that we're out of time. Our guest today is Art Schreiber, a legendary broadcaster, journalist, public servant, humanitarian, and author. So, Art, thank you for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you.
And I'm Lorene Mills. I'd like to thank you, our audience, for being with us this week on Report from Santa Fe. We'll see you next week.
Past archival programs of Report from Santa Fe are available at the website reportfromsantafe.com. If you have questions or comments, please email info@reportfromsantafe.com. Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.